Thank you all so much for being here today and for inviting me to come. It was a pleasure to meet Gwyneth this morning, but over email over the summer. And Emily, of course, I'm very grateful to be here on your campus. I'm discovering the charm of Webster Groves. I don't spend a lot of time in St. Louis, actually. But I really like it. It's very cute. And so I'm very happy to be here. So today, I'm going to give you, as Emily said, a brief preview of my book manuscript. So I'll talk a little bit about the overarching argument, but then I'll focus in on misinformation. I think that's kind of what the thematically seemed most appropriate for where you are in your coursework. So I want to start to you by making a claim that in the world today, we have access to a whole lot of information. We can turn to lots of different sources to try to learn about politics. And it's almost overwhelming. If you think that this could be overwhelming, you're not alone. So about in 2018, many years ago, about a pandemic and 2 kids ago for me, 68% of Americans reported that they are worn out by the amount of news that's out there today. Can anyone venture a guess over what percent of web traffic online goes to news outlets? You're making this no fun. Right. So some recent evidence suggests that less than 2% of web traffic actually goes to political and partisan news. So if we think about news as being an important feature of our political system and trying to sustain that informed and engaged public to help hold legislators accountable, this is fundamentally challenging if we are only really thinking about people learning about politics through the news. Less than 2% of web traffic goes to political and partisan news. So people must be learning about politics somewhere else if we're able to still have some kind of an engaged public. And of course, this is not accounting for TV and other sources like that. But there's yet another source that is largely overlooked in our scholarship and our understanding of how people come to learn about politics. And that is through our conversations with our friends and family. Political discussion has the unique ability to inform our peers at the same time that we are communicating opinion. And this can present a lot of challenges, as I'll explain to you in a couple of moments. But I want to help you think about the types of discussions I'm talking about here. So these political conversations come up in a lot of different contexts. They happen around the water cooler at work. They happen around the Thanksgiving dinner table. And of course, they happen online on websites like Facebook and Twitter. And today I'll give you some evidence about sort of these more face-to-face interactions, as well as a specific application to Twitter. And then if you're able to stick around at 1, we'll talk a lot more about these face-to-face interactions, which is much more the focus of the What Goes Without Saying book. So these conversations are happening in a lot of different contexts. But in our research so far, in trying to understand where and how people learn about politics, the vast majority tends to focus on what you see on the left, these news sources. We're interested in understanding the content of news and the content of partisan bias, comparing one source to another, and whether this exposure to news media leads people to have different preferences or can increase or decrease polarization. Separately, there has been a lot of research on how our peers can impact our political behavior, looking at things like social pressure to engage in politics, or looking at how we can influence each other to have the same partisanship or support the same candidates. But these literatures have largely been siloed and they haven't been talking to each other. And so we don't know a lot about how information is actually flowing first from these news sources and then into our conversations, and how that story might be changing as it flows from one to the other. So that's what I really tried to focus on in this book. So my argument basically is based on this idea that people play telephone with the news. So we're going to start with the news media communicating information about some story, some event, some politician, whatever it may be. That information then travels to a group of people in the public called the actively informed. In some of your coursework, you might have thought about this group of people as opinion leaders. You might have heard that term before. So this is very similar to opinion leaders. And these are people who are directly seeking out news. They're really interested and engaged, and they're actually consuming the news directly. That information then flows to their friends or peers within their networks, that I'm calling here the casually informed. These are people who are not typically seeking out news on their own from the media. They're instead sort of hearing about it secondhand through conversations or on social media. They're relying on both cues and interpretations from other people instead of, again, turning to those hard or even soft news sources on their own. And the challenge, though, is that information is going to change through this process. As the actively informed summarize what they read in the news for their peers, that information is going to be a little bit different as they put their own spin on it. In particular, I argue and demonstrate in the book that information becomes sparse, biased, less accurate, and mobilizing. And as a result, the casually informed are exposed to information that is not only different from what the actively informed are exposed to, but it is this sort of less ideal set of information where it has these qualities of being sparse, biased, and less accurate that we would probably not ideally like, although we can have a separate conversation about that and sort of the normative implications of that later, at the same time that it is mobilizing. So this idea suggests that people could be mobilized to get active in politics based on information that is sparse, biased, and less accurate. And that, to me, creates a public. It leads to the casually informed becoming underinformed, polarized, and engaged, which seems to me to be a trifecta for what I call distorted democracy. Now, in the book, I tried to take a very level-headed approach to this, where I know I'm kind of pitching this very grim story to you today, and I think I'll highlight some of the more grim findings of the book for you today as we talk about misinformation. But in the book, I do talk a lot more about how there are sort of glass half full and glass half empty interpretations of this. So I do mean very explicitly that democracy is distorted, not entirely dysfunctional as a result of this process. And I think that that's an important distinction, where there are important benefits to political communication interpersonally about politics, but we have to learn how to manage and navigate the potential downsides of it. So today, instead of going over the entire book with you, I'm going to first present to you some of the evidence I have for how political conversations actually distort the information from the news. So giving you some of that evidence of information becoming sparse, biased, less accurate, and mobilizing. And then we'll focus on how this socially transmitted information affects misinformation. So to take a step back and just give you a little bit of the theoretical groundwork for why we might expect information to be distorted. Socially transmitted information, that is information that is communicated by another person, is largely unregulated and informal. And by that, I mean, we don't usually have fact checkers checking everything that we say. So there's a little bit of this going on in social media with sort of the platforms trying to flag content that people are sharing that checks boxes of misinformation or hate speech, things like that. But in our regular conversations, unless your friend is going to sit there and Google everything that you say and sort of check to see if you're right or wrong, there's no one sort of watching over us to check whether we are communicating accurate information in our conversations. Whereas if a news outlet is going to post something that then turns out to be false, there are a number of fact-checking organizations that will call that news organization out, and they will have to issue corrections or at least be flagged as fake news or communicating false content. So this informal communication does not have the same mechanisms in place to help keep it sort of in line and as accurate as possible. And at the same time, at the human level, people make mistakes. We might just misremember details from what we read or heard on the news as we report it to others. But we're also motivated reasoners, meaning that we are likely to seek out and then interpret information that is consistent with what we already believe to be true. And so we might sort of selectively remember details from a news article that make our party or our candidates look better than others. And at the same time, so it could be some of these cognitive biases that shape the type of information that we pass along to others. At the same time, we're strategic rational actors, and we might intentionally select details or blur lines on truth to try to persuade other people to support our policies, our policy preferences or candidate preferences. And so at the end of the day, as a result of some of these mechanisms, in addition to some others that I dig into more in the book, people will transmit less information that is biased in favor of their preferences, is less accurate, and mobilizing, at least relative to the initial information that they read from the news. Okay, so this is not to say that it is necessarily wildly inaccurate, but it is at least less accurate than the information on which it was based. So how do we actually go about measuring this information distortion? There are a lot of ways we could think about doing that. One way that I have done it in the book and in some articles so far is to conduct experiments where I ask participants to first read a news article and then simply write a message telling someone else about what they read. In many of the studies, I have randomized the partisanship of the person they're communicating with, anticipating that people might sort of tailor the information that they share with others, conditional on sort of what they expect the person receiving that information to want to hear. You might talk about immigration very differently if you're talking to a Republican than if you're talking to a Democrat, for example. And if you're talking to an independent, you might feel particularly inclined to try to persuade that person if you think they might be on the fence on a given issue. So I've used this method extensively, and one of the key advantages of doing it this way is that I can look at the variation in the text, right? So people are, our IRB and our ethics review boards at WashU have not yet let me just bug people's homes to actually record their real conversations despite my best efforts. And so this is an approach to try to actually understand what people were actually seeing the first time and in those news articles, and then how do they transmit that to others. And I can compare variation in the text of these two documents. And then I can sort of try to discover whether information is changing in unique and theoretically relevant ways. And then I'll do an application on Twitter and a few slides as well. So I've conducted about a dozen of these total, about 8 of these are in the book. And so combining across all of these, I have about 3,000 responses to sort of 3,000 or 3,600 summaries of news articles that I can then compare. So to just give you some of the evidence here, socially transmitted information is sparse. Here I'm showing you just a simple indication of whether information is getting lost in transmission. So the gray bars in this figure are showing you the number of words in the news articles that people read, and then the white bars are showing you the number of words in the messages that people transmitted. Now, certainly some of this is going to be a function of the experiment itself, right? People are not going to spend a lot of time writing a message within the context of a survey experiment. So some of this is absolutely driven by the nature of the task. But suffice it to say that we're seeing a lot of drop, at least in word count. Now, you might also say, is word count really the best way to account for information? It's not. This is just an easy way for me to illustrate this for you. I have also worked with a team of undergraduate research assistants to hand code all of these messages and all of the original articles for sort of units of information. So what's sort of one fact, you could think of it as true or false, but one sort of item of information that was communicated, and sort of how many of those pieces of information were in each article and each message, and you see a similar drop. And each sort of group of bars here in this plot is one of the different studies spanning across a lot of different topics. We again and again see the same pattern where we're losing a lot of information. That to me isn't particularly surprising nor interesting, so let's get to the more interesting parts. So let's think about bias. How do we see if this socially transmitted information is biased? So again, undergraduate research assistants hand-coded each of these messages and the news articles and looked to see how many of those units of information were biased toward Democrats toward Republicans, and then also against Democrats and against Republicans to sort of get both sides of that favorability. And what we see here is that partisans are communicating information that favors their side. So what I'm plotting for you here is each group of bars is showing you the participants. So on the left, we have Republican participants. On the right, we have Democrat participants. And then the bars are colored to represent whether it's Republican in gray or Democrat in white bias. So we see here that within any of these very, very short summaries of news articles that they wrote, Republicans communicated a higher percentage of information that is biased toward Republicans, and Democrats communicated a higher percentage of information that favors Democrats. Okay, so this also might not be particularly surprising to you, but it is at least some empirical quantitative evidence suggesting that people are transmitting information that is more biased toward their side, even when the initial article was not biased. And so this is a way in which our conversations can add bias to the information environment that otherwise wasn't present to begin with. And so then if you can imagine, if people begin by reading partisan news, this is just further going to amplify the degree of bias, as opposed to starting with something that's unbiased and letting the bias grow. And just to give you a couple examples of these, so in a USA Today news article about Joe Biden's immigration policy, we had participants read all the same news article. It was coded to be completely neutral toward both sides, and the statement in red on top was written by a Republican participant, and the statement in blue on the bottom was written by a Democrat participant. So you can see that even after they read the same news article, they're communicating very different narratives about what's going on with Biden with respect to immigration policy. So if someone who is casually informed then receives one of these two messages, they're going to likely be influenced in very different ways. And I show throughout the book that that is indeed the case, and that when you receive information, this socially transmitted information like this from co-partisans, you have more polarized policy preferences on this particular topic from this experiment on immigration. When it comes to accuracy, this is definitely a case where we have glass half full, glass half empty interpretation. So I find that across all of these studies, about 3.5% of messages contained at least one piece of misinformation. So you might look at this and say, wow, people are actually doing a pretty good job. So they're reading a news article and they're not really adding a lot of information that's false. They're not really screwing a lot up. And it seems to that, that's an A, right? So about 96.5% correct seems pretty solid. On the other hand, when we're thinking about this as starting with information that did not have any misinformation in it at all, we are growing in the amount of misinformation that is being communicated. And this could further propagate out if you were to think about this as a network, right? So I tell Emily, Emily tells Gwyneth, and you move forward and move forward and move forward. This could grow and grow and grow. It also raises normative questions about what the appropriate benchmark for the amount of misinformation we're okay with in society should be. If it should be 0, then this is probably not great. But if we're okay with there being some amount of misinformation in the public, I don't know what that threshold is and how to compare this 3.5% to it. But it is the case that socially transmitted information does add misinformation to the information environment, but it is not this astronomical increase. Finally, when we think about mobilizing, it's a similar story as misinformation, where about 4.1% of messages contained an explicit call to action. This is something that journalistic norms sort of try to encourage journalists not to do. So professional norms suggest that they should not be trying to encourage their readers to take particular actions. People don't have these same norms. And in fact, they are sometimes incentivized to try to get their peers to engage in politics. And so this is, again, an increase over what they initially read. And then when paired with the idea that the information could be less accurate, biased, and just more sparse in general, they could be mobilizing them to take action in politics sort of based on information that might have some of these challenges. Okay. So these findings come from some experiments, which might be weird and might be flawed in any of their unique ways. So I want to see if this happens in the wild. So to look at this, I worked with a team of graduate and undergraduate research assistants to collect some data from Twitter where we can observe socially transmitted information in the real world. So we collected all tweets from 34 mainstream news outlets from 12 a.m. on January 6th, 2021 to 12 p.m. on January 7th, 2021. As you may recall, on January 6th, 2021, there was an insurrection at the Capitol. So I'm going to be looking to I'm going to investigate the socially transmitted information about the socially transmitted information based on news coverage of the January 6th insurrection. So I first collected all of these tweets from mainstream news outlets, not all mainstream, I guess, like there are some sort of fringier partisan sources in this data set, but it is, well-known news outlet. So I got all of their tweets. We then collected all of the replies to that original data set. And then, so there were about just shy of 500,000 replies to those about 5,000 tweets. And then we also were able to track down about 55,000 quote tweets. So the replies and the quote tweets are going to represent the socially transmitted information here, where the replies are created by everyday users sort of commenting on the tweets by the news outlets, and the quote tweets are when people are actually, they're the more interesting case, right? So this is people taking a tweet from a news outlet and then sharing that tweet with their network with their own sort of spin and commentary at the top. And I'm going to compare the text of the replies and the text of the quotes to the full text of the original tweets as well. So we had some RAs hand code about 10,000 tweets, and this for a bunch of different characteristics. The one I'll share with you here today was whether they included conspiratorial content, so any references to conspiracy theories. And then we use this as a training set to train a machine learning algorithm to predict the classification on the rest of the replies and quote tweets in our corpus. And so what we find here, so I find evidence that the quote tweets and the replies are more partisan in their language, they are more conspiratorial, and they are more mobilizing. And to show you one example of the conspiratorial content, what I have here on the x-axis is time. So going from midnight on January 6th all the way until noon on January 7th. And then on the y-axis, I have the number of tweets. The light gray line that is making this nice sort of inverted U shape is the socially transmitted information. So in this case, the quote tweets. And then the dark line that's flat across the bottom is tweets by news outlets. The dashed line right here, sorry, I'm being a walker, is showing you the moment that the protesters breached the Capitol. And so what we see here is we see this huge increase in the number of tweets referencing conspiratorial content, but we don't see this happen in tweets from news outlets. We see this happening in the social commentary going around on Twitter as opposed to the news outlets. So to ignore what everyday people are saying and when they were talking about the news on an event that was as important and sort of shocking to our political system as the January 6th insurrection means that we've been overlooking a lot of important sources of information for people. Okay, so to summarize this part of the talk today, I've shown you that content changes as information flows from media to person to person. The overall rate of distortions is relatively low, but the normative benchmark, as I mentioned with the misinformation discussion, is a bit unclear, and this is something that should be part of an ongoing conversation. But I would argue that we could sit here and sort of have these debates over what the appropriate amount of misinformation is, what we would like it to be, but maybe instead we should just move on to thinking about the consequences. and think about whether it matters that people are exposed to the socially transmitted information when it is filled with these types of distortions. So how does socially transmitted information affect misinformation? To look at this, I will show you a few pieces of evidence. So first, I will use nationally representative survey data from 3 surveys, where I'm going to use a matching analysis to try to, I am hesitant to say it is a causal effect because it is not, but it is as close to a causal effect as I can get with the survey data that I have here to compare the rates of belief in misinformation among the casually informed compared to the actively informed, where we would expect people who are casually informed to be more likely to believe misinformation after accounting for factors like variation in education, variation in interest in politics, things like that. Then I will show you evidence from an experiment where I randomly assign people to read a socially transmitted message, like the examples I showed you earlier, or the news article on which they are based, or nothing at all. And I'll then measure belief in misinformation about topics, about the topic of the news article. And in this particular study, I'm looking at environmental policy in this case. Okay, so this is a plot showing the belief in misinformation from one of the 3 surveys. So here, the gray bars, and across the next 3 plots, gray bars will always represent the casually informed, and white bars will represent the actively informed. So the casually informed gray bars are people who are receiving socially transmitted information. And what we have here is on the left, belief that Obama was born outside the US, and on the right, belief that Obama's religion is Muslim. And what we can see here, these are simulated predicted probabilities after accounting for other characteristics. And we see that the predicted probability that someone believes that these conspiracy theories that President Obama was born outside the US or that President Obama was Muslim, the predicted probability is higher for the casually informed than the actively informed. We see a similar pattern, and just this data was from 2016. This data here is from 2017, and we see the gaps are not quite as striking here. And indeed, there are some cases where the actively informed were more likely to believe rumors, like that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We can talk more about some of these idiosyncrasies, but in general, we are seeing that across a wider range of different conspiracy theories and pieces of misinformation. It is quite often the case that the casually informed are more likely to believe this misinformation than the actively informed. This data here is from 2020, and we're seeing smaller differences here. But again, in general, there is either no difference between the two, or the casually informed are more likely to believe. The experimental evidence, in my view, is actually more compelling because the survey data is so limited in our ability to identify the causal effects. And so here, again, participants were randomly assigned to receive a socially transmitted message about a news article about Biden's environmental policy, and then or they were assigned to read a news article or nothing at all. And that's the nothing at all group is the control group on the far left. And what we see here is that the percentage of participants in each of these groups that was misinformed, so that had inaccurate beliefs about fossil fuel emissions, which was one of the question items here, we find that you are most likely to believe that if you received information from a co-partisan. When you receive socially transmitted information from a co-partisan, in this case, you are more likely to believe misinformation than people who received no information at all. So this is a context in which socially transmitted information is making people worse off than if they would have just buried their heads in the sand and not seen anything at all. Okay. In contrast, some work earlier in the book suggests that socially transmitted information can help people learn at least more than they would have had they learned nothing at all, even if it's not as much as had they read a news article. But in this case, this is clear evidence that they are being led astray by the socially transmitted information that they are receiving. And then just to very briefly preview the other components. So that's sort of the underinformed side of distorted democracy, but there's also the polarization and engagement side. So on the sticking with the environmental policy experiment, the figure on the left is showing you the change in sort of people having more sorted policy preferences. So whether people's environmental policy preferences were more sorted into their partisan identity after exposure to information from co-partisans. And we see that that is indeed the case, where right there, these are the co-partisans. Receiving that information about environmental policy from a co-partisan leads to a greater increase in party sorting than receiving no information at all. And then the figure on the right is showing you the likelihood, the self-reported likelihood that people would donate to organizations or interest groups that are relevant to the policy area. And again, we are seeing that if you receive information from a co-partisan, you are more likely to engage, or at least report that you would be willing to engage in this way. So my conclusion in the book, like I previewed at the beginning, is that socially transmitted information leads to distorted democracy, not entirely dysfunctional democracy. And this is distorted because it sort of changes the way we think about what type of government we want, what type of information environment we want to have. Socially transmitted information is changing the story and is changing the way that we engage with what's going on in the world, but the impacts may or may not be alarming. Some people might be very afraid based on what we find here, and others might say, it's not so bad. And on average, we are still holding democracy together. And so I hope that one of the goals of this book is to sort of challenge everyone to think very critically about the conversations that they have with their peers within their networks when they go home for Thanksgiving and everyone asks you, oh, you're a political science major, who should I vote for in the next election? Think very carefully as you engage with your peers, because your words can have an impact on how they choose to engage in politics. And so with that, there is a huge list of people to thank for all of the research that went into this book, especially my team of undergraduate and graduate research assistants. I'm very grateful for their time and support. And with that, I want to thank you again for having me here today.